It was a cold, dark morning when Evelyn awoke with a start, her heart racing at an unsettling thought that had slipped into her dreams. The remnants of a twisted nightmare clung to her mind like cobwebs, whispering ominously of shadows lurking just beyond the reach of light. As she turned to her partner, Nathan, hoping to find comfort in his familiar presence, a scream almost tore itself from her throat but caught in her throat like a trapped bird. Evelyn blinked, her breaths quickening as her eyes widened in horror. Where Nathan's face should have been was a featureless expanse of smooth, pale flesh, an abominable blank canvas that sent shivers coursing through her spine. Flawless and horrifying, it seemed to absorb the dim light filtering through the curtains, rendering him a grotesque silhouette against the morning glow. Fear gripped her as she struggled to process the impossible sight before her. But Nathan stirred, his limbs lifting in a slow, deliberate manner. Despite his facial absence, he turned toward her, the echo of her name slipping from his lips in a guttural whisper. Evelyn. His voice was unsettlingly calm, the kind that sends icy tendrils along one's spine. She wanted to shout, to flee, but her body refused to obey her mind. She was frozen, trapped in the moment, her heart hammering against her rib cage like a frantic bird trying to escape. Despite the horror, the entity that had once been Nathan moved towards her with tender grace, arms outstretched, as if to console her. How could he be okay? How could he have no fear, no distress about the disappearance of his face? She could smell him, a mixture of cologne and something more sinister, an odor that was putrid yet clung to her memories of the man she knew. Her body finally broke free from its paralyzing grip, and she stumbled backward, fear flooding her senses. In an instinctive decision, Evelyn bolted from the bed, tearing through the dimly lit room like a wild creature, desperate to escape this waking nightmare. Behind her, she could hear Nathan or whatever he had become calling her name in that same eerie voice as he pursued her, every syllable dripping with a menacing emptiness that shrouded her in greater dread. The sound grew louder, more guttural, as she escaped the room and fled into the hallway. As she sprinted down the narrow corridor, the walls seemed to close in around her. Flickering lights overhead cast eerie shadows that danced and wavered, as if they were alive and aware of the horror that unfolded. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she could hear the unsettling sound of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate yet unwavering, almost wanting her to know that she could never truly escape. It felt as if he lingered just at the edge of her vision, waiting for a moment of weakness. Reaching a door at the end of the hallway, she fumbled with the knob, her fingers trembling as she struggled to open it. The whisper came again, echoing through her mind. Evelyn. In that whisper lay a dark memory of laughter and love shared, of evenings spent beneath an endless sky of stars. What had become of him? The thought briefly distracted her enough to feel the warmth briefly obscure her horror, but it flickered, just as quickly giving way to terror's embrace. She finally managed to wrench the door open and lunged into the living room, her eyes darting around for an escape route. The windows, locked tight, offered no solace, nor did they seem to let in enough light to banish the shadows that encased her. Frantically, she scanned every shadowed corner, every jagged nook, hoping for a sign of safety. A collective fear settled like lead in her stomach. How could she survive this? Where was the Nathan she loved? Behind her, the voice rang out again, drawing nearer, a chilling proximity that made her freeze once more. Evelyn, come back. The persistence in his tone was an unsettling promise and haunted her as she turned to face the source. As if compelled against her will, her eyes turned back to him, or rather, the monster that wore his skin. The smooth facade had begun to glisten with something dark, reflective like a menacing mirror. As she stood paralyzed, she caught her reflection in the eyes of the beast. They were filled with knowledge beyond comprehension, a strange hunger as they bore into her soul. With sudden resolve born of sheer desperation, Evelyn dashed for the front door. She could hear the last syllables of her name slipping into the air, a wretched promise as she yanked open the door, the cold wind biting at her skin as she stumbled outside. Yet the morning light did little to awaken her from her vile dream. The familiar street held a peculiar stillness, the grass covered in a thick layer of fog that crept along like serpents, twisting and sweeping around her ankles. Her heart hammered furiously in her chest as she stepped onto the street, her mind racing with questions of what on earth had happened to Nathan. The faceless memory began to take its toll, gnawing at the back of her mind. She could feel the weight of anxiety pressing down on her as she hesitated. Through the mist, she could hear movement, a soft, slithering sound that sent her heart plummeting. Evelyn. The voice echoed eerily from the depths of the fog, an unsettling reminder that no matter where she went, whatever had taken Nathan's form was just behind her, ever present, always stalking. She ran, the sound of her footsteps lost amidst the fog, only to be replaced by the soft, echoing whispers of a mind twisted by what lurked beyond sight. Where would she go? Panic set in as Evelyn tore down the street, her desperation fueling her. She didn't dare glance back, the thought paralyzed her with fear. She could feel him pulling closer, an entity that promised despair with every breath it took. The streets became a labyrinth through which she dashed, seeking any semblance of salvation, a friend, a neighbor. All futile in a world swathed in dreary fog and creeping dread. As she turned a corner, a sudden thought gripped her. She needed to get to the park, a place she and Nathan loved to visit. They had spent so many afternoons there, surrounded by the warmth of the sun and the laughter of children playing. The memories were like a beacon in her mind, urging her to find solace in the open air and the familiarity of their special place. But as she ran, the fog thickened, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket, hiding the world from view. Each step felt heavier, her legs tired from the frantic sprint. The trees lining the road loomed like ominous sentinels, their branches reaching out with bony fingers as she darted past. She could barely hear the unsettling whisper, now faint but still heated with intent. Evelyn. It slithered through the air, a ghostly echo of the love and memories they had shared. A cold chill ran down her spine. Was this really Nathan calling her, or something more sinister? Finally, she burst onto the path leading into the park, only to find that the familiar scene was now shrouded in darkness, as if someone had turned off the sun. The once bright flowers now wilted under the weight of dread, their vibrant colors replaced with shades of gray. The playground stood silent, swings swaying eerily as if pushed by unseen hands, while the slides cast looming shadows against the ground. Her heart raced as she clutched the pendant around her neck, a small silver heart Nathan had given her on her birthday. The object felt like a talisman, grounding her in moments of fear, making her remember that there was a time when everything was normal. She took a deep breath and called out, "Nathan, I know you're out there." Her voice trembled as it floated into the still air, swallowed up by the fog. Silence answered her, thick and heavy. Then it returned. Softly at first, but steadily growing in volume, the repelling whispers of the entity. "Evelyn, I'm here, just come back." Each word fell like a stone, and she could feel despair creeping into her heart. This wasn't her Nathan. The comforting embrace of their memories became sharper, cutting deeper with each moment she lingered in the park. Panic swelled within her again, and she turned away from the sound, her heart pleading for direction. She needed to find help. Where were her friends? Where were the people who lived in the neighborhood? The park usually bustled with life. Now it felt eerily empty, making her feel even more isolated. She sprinted across the grass, desperate to escape the echoes of what once was. Suddenly, she spotted a faint flicker of light through the trees. Hope surged in her heart as she dashed toward it. It could be someone, anyone who might help her. The light danced like a small glowworm, darting between the thick trunks, leading her deeper into the darkness. Battling her instincts to turn and run, she pressed on, her legs moving faster than ever. But as she got closer, the flicker dimmed and vanished. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn found herself standing in a clearing. The moon basked the scene in glimmering silver, illuminating the fog that crawled around her like a dragon's breath. Panic surged again. Had she imagined it? Was she alone again? Just as the weight of despair began to settle in her chest, the flicker returned. This time, it was brighter and more substantial, casting shadows that danced upon the ground like flickering ghosts. "Evelyn." It was Nathan's voice, but the nagging fear reminded her that she couldn't trust this voice. She clutched the pendant tighter, knowing well that she needed to choose wisely. "Help me, please," he called, and the pain in his tone twisted her heart, making her want to rush to him. But fear held her back like heavy chains. The shadows morphed, splintering in every direction like trapped wisps of smoke, and within the flickering light, a silhouette took shape. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to discern whether it was truly Nathan or the work of the darkness. "Evelyn, please." His voice rang out again, this time tighter, more desperate. Just then, Evelyn felt the cold breath of the faceless horror behind her. It was closer now, its emptiness pressing against her back like a weight she could not bear. Without thinking, she spun around to face the void that consumed her partner. "Stay back," she cried, her voice shaking with fear. The light flickered vibrantly, illuminating the details around her, casting corners of life against the dark, but her eyes were now captured by the figure standing in the shadows, his soulless gaze fixed on her. "Evelyn, trust me." Nathan's voice reached her like a life raft pulled from the depths. For a moment, the flickering light shone brighter, painting a picture of the man she loved. Memories flooded her, his laugh, the way he would hold her when the world felt heavy, the passionate kisses beneath the stars. But then the shadows deepened, and fear whispered the truth she dreaded. This was not the same. As the faceless tormentor drew closer, she felt a sudden clarity wash over her. She couldn't trust appearances. Something was lurking beneath the surface. It was a deception, one that twisted the love she once felt into a perverse mockery. With a quick glance back at Nathan's figure illuminated in soft light, she shouted, "You're not him." A fierce determination rose within her. The flickering light diminished immediately, and the entity lunged closer, a surge of darkness swallowing the glimmering memories whole. "Evelyn." Nathan's echo grew distant, lost in the void that threatened to engulf them both. Racing against the odds, Evelyn tore back toward the path that would lead her out of the park and away from the nightmare. The fog roared around her, the shadows clawing for her ankles, but she didn't stop. Each step brought her closer to safety as she plowed through the tall grass, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The distant echo of her name pulled at the edges of her thoughts, a sting that felt like a memory being pulled from her very soul. "Evelyn." It called, a plea, a haunting reminder of what lay behind. It sent shivers up her spine. With every ounce of strength she had left, she willed her legs to move faster, to break free from the horror that pursued her relentlessly. As she stumbled out of the park, the dawn began to break, a glimmer of light pushing through the fog, illuminating the path ahead with a warm glow. Evelyn burst back onto the street, her eyes scanning desperately for any signs of life. She could do this. She could find safety and uncover the truth that lurked in the shadows. But would she be able to outrun the darkness, or would it eventually consume everything she held dear? In that moment, amidst the awakening dawn, she knew that the true struggle was just beginning. Evelyn did not stop. She was consumed by a fear that felt as real as the ground beneath her feet. She sprinted through the fog-enshrouded neighborhood, where familiar houses seemed twisted and foreign, each one casting long shadows in the dim light. The air around her thickened like a heavy blanket, and each breath she took felt harder than the last, as if the fog itself was trying to choke her. The world around her became a swirling blur of shadows and whispers, an unsettling maze in which she fought desperately for escape. Panic coursed through her body like fire, igniting every flight instinct deep within her. Yet, with each stride she took, despair clawed at her insides, relentless and vile, reminding her of the danger that lurked behind her. "Where will you go?" The question cut through her thoughts like a jagged knife, a haunting echo that arose from the darkness surrounding her. The very fabric of her reality began to thin, twisting her perception of time and space. It felt as if the ground beneath her feet could part and drag her below. Evelyn felt a chilling sensation creeping along her spine, the eerie feeling of being watched, like a predator lurking just out of sight, waiting patiently for its chance to pounce. The edge of the town loomed ahead, and she spotted the familiar park where she and Nathan had spent countless evenings filled with laughter, days that now felt like distant dreams engulfed by a sinister fog. As she approached the entrance, a wave of nostalgia washed over her, but it was quickly drowned by dread. The once cheerful playground now loomed dark and tattered, a ghost of its former self. The swings creaked ominously in the wind, their metallic chains rattling like the knock of a visitor on the door of despair. The moonlight battled against thick clouds, struggling to pierce through the heavy cover, casting foreboding shadows that appeared to dance mockingly in the night. "Evelyn." The call came again, the voice edged with an unsettling mix of longing and something darker, a melody both beautiful and horrific. It pulled at something deep within her heart, an echo she cherished, yet it now felt like a haunting specter that had risen from her worst nightmares. How could this be happening? How had everything turned into this horrible distortion? She realized she could not afford to linger on the questions swirling in her mind, nor could she let the monstrous familiarity of that voice weaken her resolve to flee. The park seemed like the gaping maw of a great beast, dark and ravenous, seeming to wait with an insatiable appetite for her to step inside. Dread engulfed her as she hesitated at the entrance, but the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed behind her, propelling her forward. With clenched fists and a pounding heart, she raced deeper into the pitch-black shadows, her heart thundering against her ribs as if it were trying to escape the horror that stalked her from behind. As she dashed across the path, the trees loomed tall and twisted like sentinels, their branches stretching long fingers of shadow toward her. An unholy chill seeped into her bones, wrapping around her like a shroud. The despair lingering in the air felt almost alive, a suffocating weight that darkened her spirit with every anguished breath she took. Whispers swelled around her, growing louder as she turned to flee, a cacophony of anguished cries blending into a sinister chorus of lost souls, all begging for release. "Evelyn, please." That voice again. It was layered with a haunting plea, something that tore at the edges of her mind. With a heart heavy with dread, she made her way toward the playground, where the joy of children had long since been swallowed by the darkness. The once vibrant colors, vividly painted in her memories, were now muted, a palette of putrid browns and lifeless grays under the cold gaze of the moon. A rusted slide stood tall, dark and lonely, overshadowed by a towering tree that seemed to stretch its gnarled branches menacingly, casting further darkness over the area like a giant sentinel. The bushes swayed as she hurried past, and shadows flickered on the edges of her vision. Every rustle made her glance over her shoulder, convinced that something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight, waiting to grab her if she let her guard down. Her pulse quickened, a growing sense of impending doom clawing at her throat as the darkness thickened around her, swallowing any trace of safety she once felt. Suddenly, a low growl erupted from within the shadows, sending a jolt of electric fear coursing through her veins. It was not just Nathan's voice that echoed in her mind. Whatever sinister powers had darkened his visage and twisted his form now clawed at her sanity, skirting dangerously close to breaking the barrier that protected her from despair. She could almost feel the malevolent energy wrapping around her, a fog of darkness that sought to consume her whole. Panic surged within her. Evelyn reached the center of the park, and in her frantic flight, she stumbled and fell to the ground. Desperate, she scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding so fiercely it felt as if it might burst with terror. The park had transformed into a labyrinth, each twisted path leading her deeper into a suffocating gloom that threatened to swallow her whole. It was then that she noticed the old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching up toward the sky like skeletal hands imploring her to come closer. As she hesitated before the ominous structure, an unsettling sense of familiarity washed over her. Memories flickered in her mind. Whispers of the tales Nathan had told her, stories about this very tree, a place said to be haunted by lost souls, where nightmares could come alive. Her heart sank with realization as echoing whispers erupted in her mind like gasps of tortured spirits trapped in the grip of this forsaken land. "Evelyn," the breathless plea reverberated from behind her yet again, as if Nathan were ever so close, just beyond her reach. Her heart raced, and dread propelled her to flee toward the oak. The whispers swelled to a fever pitch. She was unsure of what lay before her in the shadows of that looming tree. She dared not look back, fearing what she might find if she did. If she could only make it to the tree, perhaps she could hide, perhaps it would refuse Nathan, whatever wretched form he had taken. But the whispers followed, curling around her like an insidious serpent. They wrapped themselves around her mind, suffocating every flicker of hope that dared spark within her. Each inch toward the tree felt like a step away from safety, drawing her deeper into an abyss from which escape seemed impossible. "Evelyn," the voice lingered, morphing into a sinister symphony that pirouetted serenely in the depths of her imagination. Evelyn reached the twisted trunk, placing her hands upon the rough bark, feeling a strange energy radiating within her. "I cannot be afraid," she whispered fiercely to herself, resolutely shaking her head to silence the whispers. But the moment she finished that thought, her breath caught in her throat. Shadows flared, and shadows did not just move. They crawled toward her, tendrils reaching out with a ghostly hunger, dressed in the long-forgotten echoes of raw past pleasures. She felt Nathan's essence again, a visceral hunger creeping closer, twisting her heart with the memory of their shared laughter, turning it into something monstrous. In a panic, she crouched low, tucking herself against the massive trunk of the oak, desperate to avoid whatever dark force had taken her once beloved partner, her heart racing against the onslaught of despair and hopelessness. "Stay away," she gasped, choking on fear. But as the winds howled with an evil resonance around her, a sense of futility washed over her. There was nowhere to flee. The whispers coiled tighter around her mind, flooding her thoughts with dread. Lost voices begged for release, ensnaring her deeper into despair. She could almost hear the stories of those who had come before her, those who had met the same fate beneath the gnarled branches of this once grand oak, now reduced to a mere shell of its former glory. Whatever creature now haunted these shadows was pulling at her heart, ripping apart the last shreds of sanity as the unholy echoes filled the air, drowning out her thoughts of hope. As she sat trembling beneath the roots of the oak, each heartbeat grew louder, thumping like a drum echoing through the inky blackness. She felt the chilling breath of something malicious outside her line of sight, hot and clammy against her skin as it coiled around her. In that moment, she could have sworn she heard Nathan's voice again, a dark shadow of what had once been his comforting presence. "Evelyn." The whisper was now wrapped in a sinister undertone, a sound like nails scraping against old wood. It filled her with dread, each syllable winding tighter around her like a noose. "Evelyn, come back to me." Drawing breath, she pressed her palms against the trunk of the tree, feeling its rough bark against her skin anchoring her slightly to the world that no longer felt real. The tendrils of darkness tugged at her consciousness, and she felt them trying to pull her into an abyss of memories, memories that now felt tainted and distorted. Evelyn had to fight against it. Nathan wouldn't want her to surrender, she reminded herself with the last flicker of hope she had. She focused her mind and called out to the darkness, her voice stronger than she felt. "You can't have me. I won't let you take me." The whispers shifted, confusion swirling through the chorus of lost souls. For a moment, silence fell around her, and the weight pressing down seemed to ease. That tiny glimmer of defiance sparked something within her, a bubbling rush of warmth against the icy tendrils of dread clawing at her heart. For the first time since this sinister game began, she felt a flicker of light fighting its way through. Then it happened. The oak creaked deeply, its roots shifting as if they were awakening from slumber. Evelyn closed her eyes tight. She could sense the energy coursing through her, the shape of it taking on form and movement. With desperately synchronized breaths, she channeled every ounce of determination she possessed, for Nathan, for herself. In an instant, a sensation surged through her, brighter than the moon lying heavy in the sky, radiating with purity. A warm light erupted from the oak, brightening the shadows around her, causing them to recoil as if stung by something powerful. The tendrils that had been ensnaring her faltered, losing their grip. For a breathless moment, she thought she saw Nathan's shadow shimmer at the edge of the light, a flicker of who he had once been, untouched by darkness. "Evelyn," his voice, now infused with strength and clarity, rang through the night air. "Run." And with those words, everything changed. The park, with all its horrors, began to twist and melt away. Where there had once been foreboding gloom was now an open canvas of light lifting the veil of terror away from her eyes. The haunted whispers faded, and the weight upon her shoulders lightened as if the darkness had finally surrendered. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart racing. She didn't know how long this moment of clarity would last, but she understood one thing. She had to keep moving. The shadows would not easily be defeated, they would be relentless in their pursuit. But right now, a window to safety was opening, just slightly, and she would seize it with all her might. She could not look back as she turned from the tree, legs pounding against the ground toward the park exit, driven by the flicker of light and Nathan's voice urging her on. She was not done fighting yet. The night was dark, shadows still lingered, and uncertainty hung in the air, but she might yet find a way to reclaim her future beyond the fog. She dashed forward, each step fueled by hope, each breath a prayer for freedom. The chase through the shadows had not concluded, it was merely beginning. In her cold sanctuary beneath the gnarled oak tree, Evelyn wrapped her arms tightly around her knees, her body curling up like a fragile flower hiding from a storm. The burly oak, with its twisted limbs reaching out like clawed fingers, felt both like a fortress and a prison. Trees often held secrets, but this one whispered too alarming for her fragile heart. Each whisper crept closer, like claws raking against her mind, stirring up memories lodged in the corners of her consciousness like dusty old boxes no one dared to open. The day had begun with such joy. Sunlight had danced through the leaves, casting a warm golden glow on everything around her. It felt as if the universe was wrapping her in a soft blanket of love, pouring melted warmth into fleeting moments with laughter and smiles that twinkled brighter than the stars. Yet now, those memories turned into shards of glass embedded in her heart, impossibly painful and irretrievably lost. Each sparkle of recollection echoed the love she had felt but now seemed as distant as the night sky filled with stars she could never reach. The air hung heavy, cradling a silence that felt unearthly and thick. It was a silence that echoed her own heartbeats, amplifying her fears with each small thud. The stillness was only punctuated by a haunting echo, a soft whisper that called her name in a way that sent shivers down her spine. Evelyn, it beckoned, silky and chilling. Curiosity crept into her mind, but it danced dangerously close to fear, like a hungry wolf circling its prey. What could this creature want from her? Did it yearn for something more, perhaps her love? Or was that long-cherished feeling now reduced to a wretched mockery of its former self? Clenching her eyes shut, she tried to deny the tears that threatened to spill. A thought clawed its way through the chaos swirling around her, swallowing her whole. Nothing she did seemed to matter anymore. Thoughts of escape flitted out of reach, flickering like a candle in a strong wind. It suffocated her gradually, the weight of despair pushing down upon her until she felt as if she might vanish into thin air, leaving no trace behind. Yet, deep within her battered heart, a frantic thrum remained, a reminder of the woman who had dared to love fiercely and freely. Beside her, the space contorted like a dark mirage, becoming a wicked reflection of her deepest fears. Shadows thickened and stretched, gnashing at her senses with a gnawing hunger, playing with the very essence of her being as if her heart was some strange game to them. It was as if the oak tree itself were alive, feeding off her terror, siphoning away the glimmers of hope she clung to. And just when she thought she could exist, be suspended in that fleeting moment of stagnation, she felt an unsettling presence flicker at her neck, brushing against her skin like a feather borne by a sinister wind. Overcome with unnerving dread, Evelyn's breath quickened. She pressed against the rough bark, seeking protection from the encroaching shadows. This moment was fleeting, yet she sensed its significance within the cage of her heart. Something terrible was intruding upon the little sanctuary she had made. This was no ordinary shadow, nor an illusion conjured by her own mind. The air around her shimmered with a treacherous energy that buzzed like bees, both alluring and revolting. With her heart pounding loudly in her chest, Evelyn turned towards the threat, the figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was Nathan, or it had once been. Her heart stopped as she took in the sight of him. His body maintained the structure of the man she had loved, the way he had stood strong and warm, always willing to protect her. But now, the absence of his face wrapped him in a shroud of borrowed flesh twisted into grotesque shapes, making her stomach churn with disgust and horror. It was a horrifying aberration, a manifestation of something ancient and utterly vile. "What have you done to me?" The words spilled from her lips as a plaintive wail, soaked in disbelief. How could Nathan, the person she had loved, have changed into this nightmare? His presence hung thick in the air, and there was something unnerving in the way the creature before her simpered, a motion that hinted at an unholy understanding of the depths of her dread. Yet it offered nothing clear or soothing, only more questions wrapped in pain. "Nath," her voice caught, trembling with disbelief as her gaze darted nervously around, the trees stretching their gnarled limbs closer, as if they were waiting expectantly for something awful to unfold. Shadows danced feverishly, twisting together in an unsettling choreography, the remnants of her love sprawled around them in breathless silence. Then, without warning, he stepped closer, hovering just out of reach, gliding like a ghost through the misty air. She quaked as the realization crashed over her like freezing water. There was no escape from this wicked fate, this transformation into something monstrous. "You do not recognize what I truly am," he rasped in a voice that felt like gravel grinding beneath her feet. There was no ounce of emotion, no longing for connection, only the hollow echo of something corrupted, something primal that spoke to the muted terror lodged deep within her heart. "What are you?" she whispered, dread washing over her in waves, crashing and retreating, leaving echoes of nausea in its wake. The figure loomed closer, an essence that was Nathan yet warped, woven from layers of the macabre and the unholy, twisting into something too hard for her fragile heart to comprehend. "I am what you make of me," the creature replied, and his voice drummed relentlessly against her consciousness like an old battle drum. The shadows swirling around him pulsed eagerly as he spoke, hungry and ravenous, a suffocating blanket threatening to envelop her being within a shroud of despair. What had once been a sanctuary of love had now morphed into a grotesque parade of horror, revealing that intimacy and comfort were but cruel illusions, tricks of light that vanished when faced with darkness. The thought pierced through her agony, filling her mind with guilt and agonizing sorrow. What have I done? She barely managed to articulate. The words clung to her throat like a bitter taste. You abandoned me, Evelyn, he hissed, and the shadows seemed to shiver in acknowledgement, echoing his claim with whispers that chilled her bones. You were destined to stay and love me, yet you fled. In that fear, a darker truth emerged. The way he spoke sent a frantic flutter through her. The very air around her quivered with dread, entwining with her sense of loss. A web of darkness spun itself tighter and tighter. No, panic surged within her, sending her heart racing like a wild horse. The implication spun through her mind like a poisonous vine, entangling her thoughts, wrapping around her neck. She had never willingly abandoned him. I would never, she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of despair. But it felt like an empty retort, for she knew, at that moment, that she had run from him. Running, no matter how justified, felt like abandoning him to the abyss. Evelyn fell into a fear-laden silence that pressed down upon her shoulders like a weighty chain. The shadows remained suffocatingly near, coiling around her thoughts like snakes ready to strike. The unfathomable dread of what lay beyond this realm squeezed the breath from her lungs, and she gasped, a desperate plea for clarity bubbling up within her. What had she invited into her life? No, her love, twisting it into this blank emptiness. The horrifying entity loomed closer, filling the space with an overwhelming pressure that seemed to sap every last morsel of hope. He reached forward, a shapeless hand cloaked in undeniable darkness, extending an invitation that felt like a curse. The echo of some twisted idea flickered in his eyes. His gliding approach wore the familiar air of love, that once easy caress that greeted her each morning, yet now it became something foul and grotesque, an attempt to bask in the shreds of love for sustenance instead of warmth. Evelyn couldn't blink away the horror that enveloped her. No, she recoiled instinctively, tears spilling over as the shadows tightened their grip, trying to pull her into despair. Nathan's voice twisted with desperation, tugging painfully at the edges of her heart like a child tugging on a beloved teddy bear, fraying its seams bit by bit. The presence drew back ever so slightly, allowing her a tiny moment of realization. You cannot escape me, Evelyn. His voice trembled with an unearthly kind of conflict. You will come back, you must. But the impression remained clear, it was not merely a plea. It was a promise steeped in malevolence, a blood-curdling reminder that hope was slipping away, leaving only darkness in its wake. Tears slipped from her eyes, tracing down her cheeks like lost rivers seeking the ocean, each one heavy with sorrow. She felt the roots of the oak beneath her, deep and ancient, listening silently to her pain. The whispers of the night swarmed around her, urging her to remember what her love meant to her before it had been twisted. Perhaps it was a fragile hope buried deep within her, something she could cling to in the midst of despair. Tell me, she whispered, her voice trembling. If you are truly my love, if there's even a hint of Nathan left within you, tell me how to fight this darkness. She felt tiny, yet inside that smallness there was a flicker of defiance, a spark that could light up the dark corners of her mind. For a moment, the creature hesitated, the jagged edges of his twisted features wavered, and something flickered in the depths of his shadow. Was it possible? Could there still be a sliver of the man she had loved? The darkness, it consumes, he rasped slowly, the words spilling forth like syrup through a sieve. But love, Evelyn, love can burn it away, but at a cost. Evelyn's heart raced. What cost? She leaned closer, desperate for answers, afraid to hope yet needing to believe there wasn't entirely lost. Nobody ever escapes unscathed. His voice carried a bittersweet reminder, dark hallucinations flickering to life around them, bridges suddenly collapsing, shadows rising with twisted faces. You must confront that which fears you. Evelyn swallowed hard, each word hanging heavy with foreboding. All around her, shadows danced like flames trying to engulf her, yet within her heart, determination began to grow. She had loved Nathan fiercely once. If he still lingered in this warped space, she owed it to that love to fight for him, even if it meant facing her own fears again. Then I must confront the darkness with the love that remains, she declared, her voice rising with newfound strength. I will not let you go without a fight. I refuse to let the darkness win. In that moment, the shadows around her seemed to recoil, as if her words had struck them like a splash of cold water. Nathan's figure lurked just beyond reach, his twisted shape caught between the light of dawn that now threatened to break. Remember, he whispered, trembling beneath the weight of her resolve. My love, it is the light. But beware, for the darkness is relentless. With that final warning echoing in her ears, Evelyn let her heart pulse with determination. She would fight to reclaim the love that had once brought her joy, even if that meant confronting the twisted shadows that had taken over her sanctuary, her heart, and Nathan himself. As the whispers grew louder and shadows curled closer, she took a deep breath, readying herself for a battle against the darkness. Perhaps she could still save him, for love was a powerful flame, and in her heart, it would ignite. It was a journey she had to undertake, with her heart brimming with courage, against the tangled shadows that entwined her very soul. Would she succeed? Only time would tell, but as long as she had breath in her lungs and fire in her heart, she would forge ahead. Evelyn's heart raced as she stood in the park, the rhythmic thumping loud in her ears. It seemed to pulse in time with the thick fog of despair that surrounded her, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. The world felt suffocating, filled with dark shadows and whispers that cradled her in unease. Once bright and full of color, everything around her had turned gray, reflecting the emptiness within. She could hear the echoes of Nathan, the boy whose laughter once rang like beautiful bells in her mind, now twisted and corrupted. It was as if his spirit was fighting within a cage, and her heart ached for the person he had once been. What had happened? The reality of what he had become cut through her with the force of a serrated blade, reminding her that love could turn corrupt and grotesque, becoming something altogether different. The shadows that loomed around her, mere flickers of her own fears, now felt like a dark army conspiring against her, growing more powerful with each passing moment. Each time she tried to move away from Nathan, this shell of the boy she once loved, she felt both fear and a deep longing, an ache that twisted in her belly. How could something she once cherished feel so terrifying? You cannot run from me, Evelyn. His voice sliced through the mist like a chilly breeze. It was calm, but the calmness sent a shiver racing down her spine. He was close, she could feel it in her bones. She dared to look back, and there he was, or at least what was left of him. Nathan, a ghost wrapped in shadows, hovering like a grim wisp of smoke, faceless yet oddly compelling. His presence clawed at her, sending waves of dread crashing over her. Evelyn, the name hung in the air between them, heavy and charged, making her knees feel weak. Time seemed to freeze as she stood rooted to the ground, her heart a jumble of wild emotions. I know you're still in there, she whispered, her voice trembling, thick with unshed tears. You have to fight this. She forced herself to believe that beneath the layers of darkness, beneath the cruel transformations, he was still Nathan, the boy with the sparkling eyes and the warmth that used to wrap around her like the sun. But deep inside, her faith began to falter, swallowed by consuming shadows that wrapped tight around her mind, squeezing her heart. You'll understand one day. We are one now, he said softly, his voice dancing like whispers caught in the wind. It began sweet but turned sinister, brushing against her thoughts like a feather that threatened to pierce her. I'm always with you. You chose to sever our bond. But I can help you understand. Each word felt like a hint at something larger, something darker, a truth she was too afraid to face. Panic bubbled inside her, and she turned to run. Her legs moved almost without her will, propelling her once again into the dim embrace of the park. The shadows twisted and snarled, alive and seemingly eager to consume her. They wrapped tighter around her, elongating and contorting like oily ribbons, suffocating every ounce of hope she had left. Where could she go? The world she once loved felt like a nightmarish dream, the very air around her thick with dread. The park had transformed, becoming an evil maze where every step felt relentless and cruel. The swings that used to sway gently now creaked like hungry jaws, and the slides loomed ominously, jagged like fangs ready to devour happiness. Each heartbeat echoed with loneliness steeped in foreboding. Every pulse reminded her that the home she had cherished, once built on love, had crumbled into dust, leaving only ruin behind. Seeking refuge, Evelyn made her way back to the old oak tree, its ancient branches extending like welcoming arms. Perhaps the roots, twisted and gnarled, would bind her tightly to the earth and provide a sanctuary against the darkness that followed her like a wolf on the hunt. She pressed her back against the rough bark, overwhelmed by the multitude of whispers swirling around her, each carrying a fragment of her anguish. "Stay away," she screamed, her voice cracking. But it was futile. Her cry was a mere wisp in the empty air, lost among the shadows. Just then, Nathan appeared beside her, flickering like a candle about to go out, an echo of memory coupled with something deeply real yet repulsive. "Evelyn?" His voice was a haunting melody, soft yet hollow. She felt him intertwining with the dark, its grip tightening around her heart like an iron vice. "You are all I have left. You cannot leave me to this darkness." "No," she screamed, the sound desperate and overflowing with emotion. "This isn't love. You're not him." Hot tears spilled down her cheeks as she fell to her knees, the ground rough beneath her, trembling with the weight of her sorrow. The dark melodies of truth hummed maddeningly at her ears, twisting her feelings into something grotesque. "You're just a shadow." Yet the shadows didn't relent. They gathered closer, wrapping around her, stifling her cries, imprisoning her within a cocoon made of despair and horror. She clawed at herself, frantically searching for pieces of the girl who once cherished the bonds of love, the girl who believed in the magic of connection. It felt like everything that made her who she was being ripped away, and she couldn't bear it. "Nathan," her voice trembled, heavy and thick with despair. "I still love you." Those words broke free and lingered in the air, stained with nostalgia and a desperate tinge of hope. But there was no echo anymore, just the haunting silence of resignation. Suddenly, the shadows surged forth, and an agony bloomed in her chest, wrenching at her being. It felt as if they were trying to pull her spirit away from her body, tearing the connection she still clung to with all her strength. Memories erupted, the sound of laughter, the warmth of a shared smile, the gentle touches that brought her joy. They swirled around her like soft specters, each fleck of recollection just out of reach, slipping through her fingers into the void. The suffocating darkness coiled around her limbs, their icy tendrils creeping in, invading her heart, and twisting her very essence. It felt like they were stealing away bits of who she once was, feeding off her nostalgia, transforming her love into something monstrous. It was blasphemous and horrible, and she screamed into the void, but even her screams felt muffled, absorbed by the dark. As hopelessness washed over her like a shattered wave, she felt the last remnants of her spirit stretching, pulling away from this corrupted reminder of Nathan. In a desperate surge, she grasped for the light, something, anything, that could save her from this desolation. But the shadows were relentless, furiously encroaching, shrouding her in their unbearable embrace. With a final, agonizing pang, Evelyn felt herself slipping into darkness, the cold enveloping her completely as she surrendered to the storm raging within. The tree stood as her witness, a silent guardian as the shadows overwhelmed her, swallowing the remnants of her soul, leaving only the chilling echoes of sadness, forever trapped with the faceless lover, entwined in a cruel dance of despair. She was lost somewhere within, flickering like a dying star, simply waiting for someone to find her again amidst the shadows that threatened to engulf her whole.